Bien, bonsoir à tous.
Good evening to everyone.
On va discuter un petit peu de ce film.
We will now discuss this film a little bit. I think this film impacts all of us. It is quite shocking, the ensemble of what is told throughout the movie. I will introduce you the speakers. My name is Serge Michel and I work for Le Monde. I'm a Swiss journalist, but I work in Paris for Le Monde and I specifically handle Africa. Elisabeth Decrey Werner, you're in charge of Apple in Geneva, quite a specific organization. You'll tell us more about it. Andrew Clapham, you're a professor of law at the Graduate Institute.
And
Rémy Friedmann, you are at the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs in charge of human rights affairs. I would like to start to ask each of you a brief reaction to this movie. A number of themes are looked into, that of privatized war, that of child soldiers. There is a link between these two subjects. How, in a sentence, how do you react to this movie? Well, I think you're right. The movie brings a visibility on two different scandals, that of private military contractors. We've seen it with the exploitation, the search for profit. We've seen in the end the question of hiring people at the lowest possible salary, people who are there to, die. And the second scandal is that of child soldiers. Why do children become child soldiers? What is the international community doing when they finally come out of the ranks of either illegal or regular armies? There are still child soldiers in regular armies, and the movie shows these two scandals, and I think we have to look into them because I feel the international community has a great responsibility in what is going on. Andrew, can I have a reaction on documentary? Well, I agree that it is very shocking, and it is even more shocking when you see both aspects at the same time, private military corporations and child soldiers, and we should say that, it is absolutely inadmissible that ages should use child soldiers or former child soldiers, but it is even more shocking to know that the United States use a company without due diligence, without trying to find out how people were recruited. But I will, I think, switch to English in order to tell you two things in terms of international law, but maybe later, because this will take me a little while, so I'll do that in a minute and I'll do it in English. Well, thank you very much for your invitation. Thanks to the FIFDH and to the Apple Geneva. This movie is a violent reminder of why we must act, why we are acting, why is Switzerland committed to what isn't necessarily a golf club.
Merci. Non, juste, je rebondis sur votre
Thank you.
chose, la Suisse.
Just bounce back on what you've said. I mean, Switzerland, Aegis has been present in Switzerland since 2010 and 2014, and the Aegis law in Switzerland has made it leave. This is part of what you're saying, when that Switzerland has to react to these issues.
Très bien, la Suisse a réagi bien avant ça, bien avant
si way before this happened and way before Aegis came to Switzerland, which was then at the origin of a legislative process for which we have now a law. The process started with the scandal that has been described in a movie, the scandal in Iraq, the scandal, and in our countries, mercenaries, people who were committing violent acts. There was this impression that there was a legal gap, a space of unlawfulness. And so Switzerland launched in 2008 the document called the Document of Montreux, where we ask of governments who hire private security firms, governments who welcome private security firms, whether for both the state that hosts the headquarters or their affairs, we ask them to respect international human rights and humanitarian law. But on the basis of this document in 2010, the sector of private security, but not only through a multi-stakeholder process, civil society, NGOs, human rights such as Human Rights Watch, private security firms, through the initiative of Switzerland and other stakeholders that are developed the Code of Conduct for Private Security Corporation Services, which requires, this is a voluntary process, which requires the ownership of all stakeholders. It took several years to put it in place in order to later put in place a process by which corporations who have signed the Code of Conduct had to go through a mechanism of control in order to make sure they respect the Code of Conduct. This mechanism was finalized last year in terms of everything that had to do with certification procedures for corporations, as well as monitoring and dealing with the complaint for violations committed by such private corporations. The mechanism is now operational. Since this year, we are operational to respond to the challenges highlighted in the film. This is something we can speak in more detail later. Yes, we will speak in more details later. Elisabeth, you often say that we have to go speak to the bad guys, because if we only speak to the good guys, then we won't change the world. So the bad guys that you often speak to are rebel groups, non-governmental group. Have you now discovered new bad guys in the private companies? Do you speak with private securities companies here in Geneva, and what does this inspire you? Well, just to say more, the bad guys are not just the armed groups and the rebels. There are also states who are the bad guys. So just think it's important to keep this in mind. The Appel of Geneva has a specificity where we talk with armed group and rebel groups on humanitarian agreements, on humanitarian issues, on the demobilization of child soldiers, on the abandonment of rape as a weapon of war. It is the specificity of Appel Geneva to work with people implicated in a armed struggle without being part of a state. So we actually do not work with state armies. We don't at this point work with private companies because we already have a great number of activities. I'm not saying we would never do it, but there is an ongoing process. So there's no point in duplicating processes. We are mostly focused on armed groups, rebel groups, liberation movements, in order to work with them on the protection of civilians, the respect of humanitarian norms, and in respect of human rights.
Mais en vérité, il y a une proximité importante.
There is actually an important proximity there.
Informels dont vous parlez n'ont pas été formés à la question des droits de l'homme. Là, les soldats
who have not been trained to the issue of human rights. These soldiers from Sierra Leone, when they come to Iraq, it doesn't seem like they have any training in terms of handling civilian population. Well, yeah, this is part of the scandal because the armed group is composed of people who, let's take the example of the Syrian revolution. These are people who have demonstrated in the street, who were taxi drivers, who were teachers, and who from day to the next find themselves with weapons and they have no training. And that is part of the work that Appel Geneva does to work so that they have code of conducts in the training of their combatants. But when it is an official company, a private military company with a headquarter in the United States or in Switzerland, and who take the liberty of sending out people who are untrained, that is a true scandal.
Andrew, je crois qu'il y a du point de vue du droit,
I think that from the point of view of rights, there are a few things that made you jump out of your chair in the film. Can you tell us a bit about it? What does the jurist say on these matters? Well, there is a myth in the film to say that there's a juridical gap. The professor in Georgetown,
you have a Filipino operating in Afghanistan, which jurisdiction does he fall under? He commits a murder, there's no law. Well, of course there is. He's covered by Afghan law, he's covered by Filipino law. If he commits a war crime, any country in the world can judge him. He could end up in the International Criminal Court. So there's a bit of a myth that by using people, somehow who are foreign, they're outside the law. But the sort of more concerning thing he goes on to say is, well, we need an international law category for a civilian with a gun, as though somehow international law or lawyers have missed a trick here and these people are operating with complete impunity, which again is completely false. If one of the armed civilians commits a war crime or crime against humanity or a murder, they fall under exactly the same laws as everybody else. In fact, if you have a Ugandan operating in Iraq or Afghanistan, they are going to be subject to the International Criminal Court. An American operating in Iraq is not. So in fact, in a way, there's more accountability for them, which is a sort of irony that...
Oui, je précise juste parce que les États-Unis ont
just to clarify, because the United States make sure that they wouldn't be submitted to the International Criminal Court.
In watching the film a second time, I felt there was a bit of a sort of hidden racism in there. This expression, which is repeated 3 times, "you get what you pay for," suggests that somehow the Ugandan peacekeeper, of course we shouldn't be using former child soldiers, but just imagine there was a Ugandan or a Sierra Leonean who was not a child soldier, that somehow they are less professional and not as good as Blackwater in guarding people. Well, to be quite frank, if I was operating for Médecins Sans Frontières or Oxfam, I would rather have Ugandans guarding me than Blackwater, who were shooting people up like there was no tomorrow in the streets because they wouldn't get out of the way. You saw it in the film, with no regard for the local life. So this idea that somehow it would be better to give it to highly professionalized ex-Americans, I think needs to be taken with a pinch of salt.
Ok, je voudrais juste savoir si tout le monde est ok avec l'anglais. Est-ce que vous avez les casques ou est-ce que vous comprenez?
Is everyone okay with English? Have you picked up your headsets?
Ok. Non mais ça, je pense que vous avez touché un point très important.
Next time I will speak in French. I think you've touched a very important point. What you are saying is that you would rather be looked after by Ugandese rather than Americans from Blackwater.
Et vous dites aussi,
but you're also saying
bien sûr, ils ne devraient pas employer des anciens enfants soldats.
They shouldn't be using former child soldiers. But I also find that quite strange because the bosses of Aegis actually said after the documentary in saying when we recruit people, we don't ask them whether they're former child soldiers because that would be discrimination. Because in the end, former child soldiers are entitled to a job like everybody else. So what does the law say on this matter? And then what does moral say?
La morale commence.
Okay, so you're the moral.
Je crois qu'il faut revenir aussi dans le contexte d'aujourd'hui.
We have to take it back to today's context. To nowadays, most child soldiers are not those that we saw in the movie who have been kidnapped, drugged, forced to come back and kill their parents. Today, the child soldiers I met in Syria or in Congo, for instance, they want to go fight. There are voluntary commitments, and I put voluntary between brackets. Voluntary because they don't have many other choices. In Syria, schools are closed, there are no activities, there is this spirit of defending one's cultures, one's country, and so they want to go and fight. So this is already something that separates them from the child soldiers we've seen in the movie. And the second question is about what is the international community doing in order to offer alternatives to the children before they go out and fight. And then we see that we have demobilized child soldiers. They're angry with us. They felt like that we've taken their power off of them. The young man said it in the movie, when I have a weapon, I feel strong because I control it. So what are the processes of demobilization today? For the past 15 days, over the past 15 days, we have demobilized 56 children in DRC, and no one is there to reintegrate them, to take care of them. So we quickly try to find solutions for them, but they've actually been dispersed into several families. In the families, they're fed once a day, whereas in the army, in the rebel groups, they were fed 2 to 3 times a day. So these are the initial questions of these child soldiers who are no longer like the children we saw in the movie. If these children are correctly integrated, if they have a job, if they have a training, if they have a choice, and they want to go like a young American would, for instance, some young Americans would want to go and fight, contracted by a private company, offering them a decent salary, some proper protection measures. When you go and fight a war, you have to find protection measures, how to respect civilians or civil populations, then I wouldn't have a problem. I wouldn't be shocked by it. If the child has had a good reintegration process, if the child has a choice that he can make in full awareness, and it is something that he does choose, then I'm not shocked. But what we see in the movie, I'm profoundly shocked about, and what shocks me is that the international community is not doing anything about it, or at least very little, in regards to child soldiers we are demobilizing. This is also said in the movie. There is an amazing reservoir of of cheap labor in Sierra Leone because of the civil war in the 90s. So there is a true lots of cheap labor there. So the mobilization you see in Syria are phenomena which maybe will have create a future labor then. But now if you want to have soldiers, it's best to go to Sierra Leone or Syria because they're still busy in Syria. Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not going to go to Sierra Leone because right now the motivations of these companies is not because there is a good network or easy recruitment. It is because it's cheap. It's because they don't ask any questions. It is because we don't need to train them in any specific way. Andrew, from the point of view of the law, you are saying that no one should recruit former child soldiers to fight in Iraq or Afghanistan. Why? Well, I think that a company shouldn't traumatize their employees, and this is what's going on in the movie. But in order to put it in context, nowadays there are no longer these large companies do no longer exist in Iraq and Afghanistan. I don't think I don't think that in the future they will recruit hundreds of thousands of people after done. This is what happened from 2003 to 2010. But we've said now that Americans are no longer willing to pay for this, and the sector has therefore changed. It has professionalized itself quite a bit. Rémy and I have seen some corporations in Africa, in Uganda, in Kenya, where there are private security companies who are watching rhinos in parks. But it's not just Iraq and Afghanistan. That was about 10 years ago. But in the future, the sector is to change very much. Rémy, did you have a comment? Yeah, thank you. Just to add to what was just been said, the sector has indeed evolved. It has also evolved because the state, civil society, and the industry itself have taken into account the necessity to put order in all of this. When we speak of fighting in the different countries, you've mentioned the Aegis law, but the Swiss law that also regulates private security sector in Switzerland, and it actually refers to the Code of Conduct, which is an instrument of soft law, a voluntary one, and there are a number of private security companies who have to adhere to the code, and they have to submit to this mechanism of supervision and activities of mercenaries to go and combat on the side of troops or with troops or for official troops. These activities are now forbidden by Switzerland, and they are not allowed by the code. The code requests that private security companies only use strength in case of an urgent need to defend oneself. So in regards to this question of secretariat, such as executive outcomes, this is no longer what happens. We now have a system in place. So you're saying that these two wars that were started by George Bush, so now there's an amazing code of conduct, there are less conflicts. So is this film a historical documentary? Is it something that only treats of the past? No, this film actually highlights our challenges and the fact that a code of conduct now needs a monitoring process, and this question of selection and the proper examination of the people who are recruited, a vetting process which is prescribed by the code, and the recruiters now have to, it is now forbidden, yes. Now one has to examine the physical and psychological condition of the people who are recruited, what their history is, what their past in terms of human rights has to be taken into account and examined by corporations. So we have a universe of possible recruits that need to be properly illuminated through the monitoring process of this organization, which is recent, which has just born. So it is actually not illegal through the Code of Conduct to hire a former child soldier for a contract in Iraq and Afghanistan, but you shouldn't do it if the child is traumatized, if the child has suffered post-traumatic stress disorder following his mobilization as a child. Well, the system of mobilization reintegration through psychological treatment has been set in place, and a private security firm who hires such and such person on site, whether in Africa, in Uganda, or elsewhere. It's possible for them to hire the person, but it is not. It is about not traumatizing the person further. So yes, there is work to be done in terms of vetting and examining by the company, and all of this is submitted to the code of conduct, and there is a possibility for complaint mechanisms.
Ma réaction, d'abord, on ne parle pas dans ce débat de
Well, first of all, in
la
this
formation des
discussion,
combattants.
we're not talking about the training of these combatants. We're talking about the contractors, we're talking about those companies that are making a lot of money out of this.
Moi, j'attends de voir,
And from the code of
c'est bien d'avoir un
conduct, I
code de
think
conduite, mais c'est
it's
comment
very
on
good
est
to have
capable
it,
de faire le suivi
but what's very
de
important is
quelqu'un
how
qui a
to
recruté
implement it
un
and how
ancien
to
enfant soldat pour dire
follow up
qu'il
and
est tout à
check
fait
that the
bien
companies
dans
that
sa
are employing
peau,
these
capable
former
de savoir ce
child
qu'il va
soldiers
faire,
are checking
ou pas.
that
Tout le
these children
suivi,
are
nous, on le
in
voit
a
parce
fit
qu'on
state to
signe des
fight.
accords avec ces
In
groupes
Syria,
armés.
we don't see
Le-
that because we
le
sign
moment où ils
agreements
signent
with
des
these armed
accords,
groups, and when they
c'est le
sign those
début du
agreements,
travail. C'est
that's
le
the beginning
suivi, est-ce
of
qu'ils vont
the work that
respecter
we
ces
do
accords,
in
et qu'est-ce
following
qu'on
up
fait,
those
voilà,
agreements and
pour
checking that they are being
améliorer
implemented.
si le respect
What
n'est
can be
pas-
done
n'est
to
pas parfait.
improve the
Donc,
situation
moi,
if they're
je-
not being
c'est
respected?
nouveau,
They're
mais
the kind of things that we
j'attends
looked
vraiment
at.
voir, c'est là qu'il va y avoir le gros défi. Le code
It's
de
new,
conduite,
but I
c'est
do
bien.
think that
Comment
that
il est respecté,
is the
c'est la
important
question
aspect. It's
suivante.
implementation
Et
rather than
puis,
the code itself.
voilà, je disais la formation. Est-ce
And
qu'il y a
then we've got a
des
training.
formations qui doivent être
Are there
poussées
training
en termes
programs
de
that need to
protection des
be
populations
a
civiles,
little bit
en
more
termes de
serious in
respect,
terms of
du
protecting
droit
civilians,
humanitaire?
in
On
terms
en
of
a
the
pas
need to
parlé,
respect
c'est
international law?
absolument pas
We
venu
haven't
dans le
really
film.
talked about that.
Alors,
It wasn't
on dit qu'il
something that
viole
appeared in
un
the
certain
film.
nombre de droits,
We
qu'il
heard that a
tire
number
sur
of
les civils,
rights
mais
were violated, that they
personne
were
à un moment dit,
firing on
il faut
civilians,
maintenant tous
but
ces
no
gens
one
qui
said to
partent
them,
avec
look,
des compagnies et une
all of these people
formation
going off
très
with
poussée de
private
respect
security
du droit
firms
humanitaire,
need
ce
to
qu'on
have
doit
training
faire dans la
in
guerre, pas.
respect for international
Et on n'en
humanitarian
parle-
law,
et on n'en parle pas, et pour moi, c'est un élément clé.
what to do
C'est
during a war.
l'élément
I think that's a key
prévention,
aspect for
parce
me,
que c'est exactement
because
ce
that's
que nous faisons.
preventive.
On peut
That's
toujours
what we do.
réparer l'enrôlement
We can
d'enfants
always
soldats par
try
des
to
tentatives de
repair the
réinsertion,
situation
dont on
by
sait qu'elles sont
reintegration
très
of child
On peut
soldiers, even though we know
toujours
that's very
réparer,
difficult.
d'avoir lancé cette idée de compagnie
We
militaire
can
privée en mettant des
always
codes
look
de
at the
conduite.
situation
Mais
of
qu'est-ce qu'on fait en
private
amont
military
comme
companies and have codes
prévention
of conduct, but what do you do in terms of prevention? And that didn't appear in the
Oui,
film.
Andrew.
Peut-être juste une précision. Il faut absolument pas
Just to clarify one thing,
formation au droit international humanitaire.
you shouldn't really give training in international humanitarian law because these firms are not used to carry out wars. That's the impression you get in the film. But Americans and British governments don't use private companies in real combat. They tend to be used for security, protecting an ambassador going through Baghdad, for example. So you need to provide training in human rights to teach them how to react as a police officer. Of course you can't fire on civilians, as Rémy said earlier. This is the problem with Tim Spicer and his band, his group. These are former soldiers who know about war, and they think they're still in war. But actually, the work that they often do is not connected with a war situation. It's like being a police officer in Geneva.
Sauf qu'il y en a qui ne sont pas revenus. Enfin,
But some didn't come back.
on voyait un enterrement là.
You know, we saw some of them had actually been killed in combat. Yes, that's true. And there are demonstrations in Iraq which are extremely violent, but they're not involved in a war, so you shouldn't think that they're back in a war situation. That's why they shouldn't be using child soldiers, because they have been through a war situation. And like a South African mercenary who was firing on blacks in South Africa, you shouldn't be recruiting people with that mentality.
Okay. Rémy, vous pensez alors que le code de conduite
so you
permet
think that
maintenant
the
de
code of
contrôler ce genre
conduct
d'abus
is going to
qui sont
enable us to
d'abus dans le film?
prevent those
Et
types
vous
of
êtes conscient
abuses?
que le code de conduite, une fois
Are you
bien
confident
implémenté,
that once it
pourra,
is correctly implemented, this code of
à
conduct
la
will
fois,
help?
comment dire, faire ressortir les abus,
You'll be able to identify
conduire la
abuses
compagnie à s'auto-limiter,
and help
commettre
companies
un
self-regulate
Code de
and
conduite est complémentaire, il ne
stop
s'agit pas
those
d'une
abuses. It's
initiative
complementary.
complètement isolée.
It's not an isolated
C'est un
initiative.
effort
It's
d'État,
an effort
de l'industrie et d'ONG
by
qui
states,
jouent leur
industries,
rôle
and
de garde-fou et
NGOs who are
d'observateur
trying
de la
to
situation
play their monitoring role
à un défi très,
in order
très
to
concret
respond to a very
qui est
tangible challenge,
celui qu'on a vu ici,
which we
et
saw
celui qui
here in
pourrait
this
se
film.
présenter dans d'autres contextes.
which might
Donc
come up in other
le défi
situations.
est immense.
So
il est
it's an
très
enormous
grand.
challenge.
On a actuellement à peu près une centaine d'entreprises privées de
There are
sécurité
about
qui
100
ont adhéré au
private
code et qui
security
sont
firms who
prêtes
have
à se
signed up to this
soumettre à ce
code now
mécanisme
and
de
who are ready
monitorage.
to
il y en a
accept
déjà
the
qui ont été,
monitoring
entre guillemets,
mechanism.
signalés, punis,
Have
payé une amende,
some
quelque
already
chose.
been punished, and have they paid
La
fines or something?
sanction qui
Well,
peut
the
avoir des
sanctions
conséquences
do
fondamentales
exist.
sur le
and they have an impact on the business of that firm, because they could be excluded from the code. Because more and more clients now ask firms, particularly states and in the private sector, they demand from these private security firms that they've signed up to these code of conduct and that they respect them. So if they are excluded from the framework, then they might lose business. The mechanism itself has just been launched, and dealing with complaints is something that's now being done since the 1st of January this year, actually. So complaints, I'm sure, will come in, and they'll be dealt with those companies directly. But the code of conduct doesn't replace the responsibility of states, the law, the rule of law, and of course the jurisdiction of these different courts. Who can complain? Who can lodge a complaint to the code of conduct? A former child soldier, for example, who thinks that he shouldn't have been recruited. Who could lodge a complaint? Who do you think is going to lodge a complaint? Well, anyone. Any community or representative of a person who thinks that they've been affected, who believes that they may have been affected negatively by the behavior of a private security firm or a member of one of those firms who signed up to the code, could submit a complaint. And our monitoring role will be to follow that up, irrespective of complaints. And do you have investigatory services to help you with that? If someone says, my son has been killed by a Sierra Leonean employee in Afghanistan who wasn't supposed to be in a military role, would there be an investigation? No, we can't replace existing investigatory mechanisms. We would sort of direct the complainant towards an authority who could give them an effective remedy. The law, for example, the Afghan legal authorities. Do you mean the Afghan courts? Well, I don't want to talk about the Afghan justice system myself, but you understand what I mean. I think to respond to that, what's important is not just to complain and to have individual complaints, because that individual will probably disappear when he knows that he's guilty. What's important is to complain against the firm, because you need to have measures against Aegis and other companies, because they are those who are responsible and they have the money to change the situation. So, of course, that person who fired on someone else is a criminal and could go to court. But I don't think that would be the key, because you need to go against the companies themselves.
Alors justement, je crois que suite à ce documentaire,
I think after this documentary,
il y a deux anciens enfants soldats qui ont
former child soldiers
en Irak qui ont déposé plainte
soldiers in Iraq submitted complaints against Aegis. They went to see a lawyer in London, and there's someone actually helping them, and I think that's legal proceedings are still ongoing. Do you think it might be successful? Do you think two Sierra Leoneans could actually win against a company like Aegis? Well, I know the lawyers in London, and they're very top lawyers. Good luck.
Il a fallu 4 ans pour qu'ils partent de Suisse, donc peut-être que...
4 years went by before they went to that stage. Well, it depends on the jurisdiction of the courts in London. I don't know the details. It is possible, though. Aegis is registered there in London, has an office there in London, so yes, they are complaining that the company took them on without checking the trauma that they'd already suffered in the past from their experience as a child soldier. Do you think that's acceptable in English law? Yes. Why not? You don't need to go into very complex theories about that. You see in the film that in the Committee of Inquiry, they didn't look at that at all. They we saw that it wasn't very high level in terms of looking at the awareness of child soldiers. That was something that was excluded from the inquiry in the United States. So I'm pretty pessimistic about the outcome of this proceeding in London. But if the politicians in the United States don't want to address that issue, that's something else. But if a company has to respect their staff, then that is a legal issue.
Je pensais... Il nous reste une demi-heure, je pense.
Well, we have half an hour left, so I thought about opening this up to the floor.
Est-ce qu'il y a un micro pour la salle?
Is there a microphone going around in the room?
Super. Et puis en haut, je vois pas grand-chose.
Great. I can't see above, but I think there are people
Donc
up on the
voilà,
balcony as well.
je prends vos questions volontiers.
Okay, please, if you have any questions,
Parler,
go
madame
ahead.
ici au milieu.
The lady here in the middle,
Passer le micro.
could we have a microphone for her, please?
On pourrait s'entendre autrement, mais le micro est important pour les traducteurs, je pense.
Oui, merci, merci beaucoup
Thank
pour
you.
ce documentaire.
Thank you for the documentary, which
Je suis
was
ancienne
very powerful.
humanitaire Médecins Sans Frontières.
I used to work
J'ai
for Médecins Sans
travaillé 3
Frontières
ans
as a
au
humanitarian. I
Liberia
worked for
durant
3 years in
la
Liberia
période
during the
Taylor.
period of Charles Taylor,
Et il m'a dit donné bien sûr de rencontrer des
and I met
enfants soldats.
child soldiers
La
then.
question pour moi,
My question
aujourd'hui, c'est
really
comment
is how
travaille-t-il avec les gouvernements dans lesquels ils
do
recrutent
you work with the
les
governments
enfants
who
soldats?
recruit
Parce que Madame
child
Hélène
soldiers?
Sirleaf,
Ellen Sirleaf
visiblement, elle a 70 000 enfants soldats dans
has
ce pays, ou anciens
70,000
enfants soldats.
former child
Et
soldiers
vous
in
avez
her country.
Voilà. Donc, est-ce qu'il y a
And I wonder,
comment je pourrais dire, la responsabilité du
where
pays
is
dans
the responsibility of
lequel
the country from where these former child
on
soldiers are coming from?
recrute ces enfants? Voilà, quel est le rôle?
What is their role?
Moi, je vous pose la question.
That's my question.
L'auteur du documentaire est pas là.
Well, the filmmaker isn't actually with us tonight, unfortunately, so I don't know. I'm a journalist. I'm not the filmmaker, unfortunately,
On peut pas, enfin,
myself.
on n'a pas fait une enquête spécifique.
So I didn't look into this issue myself. Does any of you have a reply to that, to the links between Aegis and the Sierra Leonean or Liberian governments?
Je pense que Libéria est
Well, I think
responsable.
Liberia is responsible. Of course, if you look at international law, they're responsible for anything that happens in their country if they haven't made enough efforts to stop that type of recruitment.
Recrutement direct,
Direct recruitment
par les
and
compagnies.
this indirect recruitment by those companies. But your question was about the governments, I think.
Say.
This is happening without the microphone. If there could be a microphone for the speaker.
Ok, pardon, oui, oui, maintenant je comprends mieux, oui.
Okay, I
Je pense
understand.
que oui, on peut parler d'une responsabilité de Liberia.
Yes, you could say that
mais
Liberia is
là,
responsible in that sense.
Interpretation.
Je crois que une des réponses, c'est que
I think one thing we could say to that is one of the former heads of Aegis was employed by the United Nations in Sierra Leone during the demobilization, and so he knew the market, let's just say it that way, and the talent in that country. Is there another question? The lady over there. There are two of you.
Et en haut, vous avez des questions.
And then up on the balcony, if there are any questions as well.
Il y a des gens.
There are people up there.
Bonsoir, merci.
Bonsoir.
Good evening.
J'ai une petite question rapport au professeur de
I have a
droit.
question to the law professor.
Ok, très bien. Donc, on est dans des pays en guerre.
Okay, we're talking about countries at war. There are national legal jurisdictions there which are fairly ineffective, or at least you could imagine that they are. You say that humanitarian law doesn't apply because these companies aren't actually in a war zone.
L'application des droits de l'homme
So what about human rights law at the international level, which is extremely complicated? So what do you advise? Do you think there should be universal jurisdiction, that states should take this issue up? Third parties on behalf of common values and say we need to take action against Aegis, or states that allow Aegis to have headquarters or where Aegis has operated. Tangibly, what can be done at a legal level? I think that is a good question. I think the solution, as I said earlier, is not to focus on states. If you focus on Afghanistan, in the situation that they're in, or in Iraq, they aren't capable of dealing with that situation. And as you see in the United States, they don't really care about this. So you need to focus on Aegis itself and lodge legal complaints against them so that they wouldn't be able to work anymore. Take away their registration so that you force them to change their attitude. Because the problem is, if you just focus on the states, Philippines, for the Filipino who works for Aegis, or Great Britain, or the United States, then they don't really care. This idea of privatizing war is to shirk responsibility. So you can look for solutions between states, but in my experience, it's better to focus on the companies themselves. But what do you mean by we? Who would do that? Who could complain? Well, as legal experts ourselves, we could complain. We might not find the solution in classic international public law. So that's why I would like to invoke universal jurisdiction. But there you need to find a criminal. You need to find a prosecutor, a court with the jurisdiction to actually try somebody. That's very difficult. And few of the people involved have been brought before a court. In Blackwater, there were a few people, but that's a tiny minority. Universal jurisdiction can be used to try an individual. You can use normal, ordinary law to lodge a complaint against Aegis, or use universal jurisdiction against them. This is a legal discussion, but I think civil society also has a role to play. I think if jurists can find solutions, that's great, and you've talked about a few of them. But I think civil society can also have a very important role to play, and must play a very important role. What could they do? You say we could try and improve the situation, we could adopt codes of conduct, but in fact, we have a situation that has a fatal flaw, because these companies are just trying to make as much profit as possible, and so they're going to go and try to recruit people as cheaply as possible. What can civil society do in that context? Well, I don't have any ideas myself precisely, but I think we saw that in a few areas. There were some very difficult situations, and civil society has been able to play a key role. For instance, on the landmine ban. That treaty really came from civil society mobilization, because states weren't really interested in that. So I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but I think civil society has shown that it can mobilize and organize and achieve amazing results.
Oui, Madame, au fond.
The lady over there, at the back.
Bonsoir, merci
Good evening.
pour ce film.
Thank you for that film.
Je doute un petit peu, bon, il est très très bien fait, c'est intéressant et touchant, mais je doute qu'on puisse, ayant été enfant soldat, avec le nombre de traumatismes
traumatic experiences that a child soldier has been through, I very much doubt that you can trust them when they have a weapon in their hands. Even in the film, you see that when he's in Iraq, he suddenly is reminded of what happened in Sierra Leone. And what's he going to do in that situation? Well, I'm not sure, as a psychotherapist myself, that wouldn't go badly wrong. Taking up arms again after a traumatic situation like that is very worrying. In the French Legion, you don't ask them about their past either. And private companies, you are asking them to sign this code of conduct, but the code of conduct is often not respected by armies themselves. So what would the role of private companies be if you ask them to sign up to this code of conduct that even armies don't have? Taking the example of France, the French Legion, they don't really care about the past of soldiers. And so I'm very doubtful. I'm delighted that there are mechanisms in place, but I'm a bit doubtful about the effectiveness of them. That's really what I wanted to say about that. I'm sorry to be critical, but I'm playing devil's advocate, because codes of conduct of regular armies don't really exist, and so I'm doubtful. Okay, on the difference of the legal frameworks between private companies and the golf clubs, and then regular armies. Andrew, what would you like to say about that? Thank you for the question. I totally agree with you on that first point. I don't think you can ask someone just to pick up a weapon again and forget their past. And the second issue, well, you could ask a military firm to have a higher code of morals than the French Legion. I wouldn't have any problem with that. Just saying that they should be at the same level as the French Legion, that's not enough. I think you need to go further than that. And you can ask them to carry out investigations, to look very carefully about the people they're recruiting. So I don't think there is a problem with double standards in that.
Well, they have a lot of money. I mean, as you've seen, these companies are extremely rich, and they're complaining, saying, oh, we cannot do research, this will cost us a lot, but we could insist that they have to do research on who they hire. Rémy, did you have a comment? Well, simply to add that in the domain of private security, it is also the client of private security companies to put the price of demands, depending on the requests that the states or whatever client has in terms of human rights. Private companies also hire these private military security companies. It costs on the short term, but on the long term, it actually pays to respect human rights.
Développer un peu ce point-là peut-être.
Can you develop that just a bit more? Well, it pays to respect human rights. I'll give you the example of an extractive corporation who extracts gold or any other extractive product in a country with a complexity, in a complex context, and they're protected by private security forces or military security forces. And if this company doesn't apply a code of conduct, or if they do not restrain the behavior of their subcontractors or the companies, the corporations that protect such operations, then when a conflict arises in a given context, for a conflict such as the one in Iraq or elsewhere, well, if the response of the company is to violate human rights, then there can be an escalation, and the operations may stop and could be interrupted, and this is costly. Violating human rights is expensive, and there is a long-term benefit in spending one's money and to have human rights as the core business of the private sectors and of corporations. Is it wishful thinking? We say this, but in the end, things are quite different, aren't they? We see Glencore and other examples.
Non, mais reprenons peut-être d'autres questions dans la salle.
So let's perhaps go back to other questions in the room.
Troisième rang avant le bouffe.
The gentleman on the third row.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Well, my question is as follows. I would like to exit a certain ambiguity. The film was about child soldiers, an international market. We can see that in the film, the documentary we were shown, it was also about something else, and it was about the privatization of conflicts. Madam, your neighbor on the left is saying they're keeping embassies safe, but I have traveled a little bit in the world, and when those who guard embassies in Geneva are not the same as the one I've seen in the movie. So I feel like armed as they are, they're ready for war. So my question is as follows. Are war laws applicable or not to these people? And if they're not, can we have them be condemned for criminal organizations? Just simple like that. Criminal activity, organized crime.
Yes.
Oui, non, pardon, j'ai dit qu'ils gardent des ambassades, mais
well, I've said that they're
aussi.
watching embassies and they're also watching ambassadors. And when you've seen in Blackwater, the man with a tattoo, he was being the bodyguard to the U.S. ambassador going through Baghdad. This is what he was doing. He wasn't actually involved in the war. I know they have much bigger weapons than what they need for that, and that is part of the problem. But they are not actually shooting Al-Qaeda fighters or the Iraqi army or anyone else. They are there to create a safe corridor for diplomats to cross the city, and that is part of the scandal. It's true that it is not as it is here for the permanent missions here, because the context is very different. But yes, I can assure you that most of the arms and the training that you've seen in the film is not for combat, is not for war. They actually have security missions, and that is part of the problem, because we are to say that we can ban them as a criminal organization. It's not true, because it is the U.S. Government, as the occupying power, has put them in place. They have an actual job. So from a legal point of view, we cannot say they're a criminal organization. Another question on the third row?
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. My name is Léa Winter from the NGO Fien Suisse for the Right to Food. I was very surprised to hear that Switzerland was at the origin of an initiative on the Code of Conduct, and I would therefore like to ask you, in terms of the process that's currently going on in the United Nations, trying to adopt a binding treaty to rule transnational cooperation, why within this process isn't Switzerland supporting the process, whereas this is very much a process that could bring forward these type of processes, and it is in fact supported by civil society. Well, Switzerland considers that the idea of a convention, the one being debated in the UN, the binding treaty for transnational cooperation, is a very legitimate process that raises the right questions, but we consider that the Code of Conduct or the Code of Montreux are more immediate, pragmatic responses, which are more pragmatic than that of a convention that may see the light. For now, we've been speaking of this convention for many years. There isn't yet the necessary consensus between states for this convention to see the light of day, and we are following the process. We are following the process, but we are pragmatic, and we are working with the concerned stakeholders in order to have a more impact, a direct impact on the terrain. So far, the convention, which is not a convention but a binding treaty, doesn't exist, and we feel it doesn't yet have an impact, but we feel that both approaches are absolutely legitimate and complementary.
Là-bas.
Another question on the right?
Oui, bonjour. J'ai beaucoup aimé le film.
Good evening. I very much like the movie, but I'm actually a bit disgusted about what I hear from the panel. I feel that the Code of Conduct is a Code of Conduct that says how one should behave, but to tell a criminal how he should behave is, I find, quite hallucinating. I think it's not worth more than toilet paper.
Dans cet reportage, c'est la privatisation d'une guerre.
C'est hallucinant que ça
peut exister.
It is hallucinating that this could exist, and no one seems to question that. How is it possible to send someone from sub-Saharan Africa to a conflict in a country they're not even familiar with? We've seen a few fragments, a few sections where there was someone shooting on a citizen, and they were talking to them in Arabic, because that's his country, that's his language. It's normal that he should be spoken to in Arabic, and therefore the one with the weapon didn't even understand what the citizen was saying, and he was actually making fun of him. It could have killed him. He wasn't at all protecting an ambassador or anyone else. I'm not sure. Well, I would have liked for the person who made the film, the filmmaker, to be in the room. I think it would have been a lot more interesting, because I feel that you're perhaps being the devil's advocate on this front. And I don't understand. I really would like to answer to this observation, to this comment.
Chercher des réponses.
The fact that we're looking for responses,
essayer de répondre à ces questions
and
qui sont soulevées ici,
responding the questions that we are raised here doesn't constitute the legitimation of. It doesn't mean that we're legitimizing what is going there. To try to develop the Geneva Convention doesn't mean we're legitimizing the war. It means that we're trying to give a response to a given situation. Can we live in a world without any laws, without any rules? The fact to try and answer to a given context, is that condemnable? Are you not perhaps trying to do something about situation? I think this is what we all must do, and the fact that we are here, that we are committed as Switzerland, as a country, to respond to these questions. We try to have everyone on board, including civil society. I think it is legitimate. It is not about legitimizing war or private security companies. It is about recognizing that there is a reality, that there are some non-state weapons holders, and we also need to communicate with them, and this is what the appel
Madame, votre indignation.
I understand, Madame, your indignation, but
le fait que la privatisation de la guerre,
perhaps the fact that privatization of war is a phenomenon that came to light after the executive outcome in South Africa and the two Iraqi and the Iraqi and Afghanistan war. There were quite a few documentaries and films on this issue. What is new about this film is the fact that it is showing how in these private in this privatized war markets, the fact that one is diminishing costs by looking for soldiers in countries where salaries are way lower than the US wages or British wages.
Je pense que on peut dire, on pourrait affirmer ici très fortement que la privatisation de la guerre est une horreur,
is horrific, it is an abomination, but yet that doesn't solve the problem. I think there are some concrete measures to be taken in a context where this privatization has indeed already appeared. But we can also fight against this privatization, because if one puts in place a code of conduct, it means that you are somehow saying, yeah, it's okay to do it, let's see how you can do it, how we can behave, and I don't think that's a response.
Bon, ça, je pense qu'il y a un très large débat là-dessus.
I think there's a very large debate to be had. I mean, the ICRC in Geneva has been in Geneva for decades and who takes care of conflict victims. So there are many people from ICRC who are saying, am I not facilitating things because people can go to war and we come and then help them? No, I think the evil exists and we have to deal with it rather than to just say, oh, it shouldn't exist. Very briefly, I think we shouldn't oppose one to the other. The privatization of war has existed in Switzerland forever. The Swiss had the best mercenaries. They were very much sought after. And what has said Rémy Friedmann is correct, but at some point there are wars. And I think we all here would wish a warless world, but there are wars, and the rules of war are becoming indispensable so that on a battlefield one may not be able to do whatever they want in order to protect civilians. It doesn't mean that we can continue doing everything we can so that wars do not exist. It doesn't mean that we mustn't stop revolting against such phenomena that have been existing for a long time. I don't think this is contradictory. I can be a pacifist and fight against the war and spend my day's work engaging with armed groups, not just to tell them you shouldn't, of course telling them that they shouldn't be a war. We try to find peace solutions, but I tell them that they have to protect civilians. You cannot attack civilians. I don't think it's a contradiction to work on both fronts. I fully agree with you. We can't treat the airport gentleman the way it has been seen in the film. I agree with you to say that these are the wrong people in the wrong place. They have an ambassador in the truck, they have to take him back to the airport, and they're shooting everyone. But it is not a war zone in the sense that this is not a combat. And the problem is that we've taken former militaries who think they're entitled to shooting rather than taking someone who's a real bodyguard. And this is what I was trying to explain. But I'm not defending them. Blackwater's is the enemy for me. And they now have taken the name Academy, which is another spoil for me. I would like to also say, Madam, as a journalist, I've been to Iraq and Afghanistan. I've done embedments with the U.S. armies in both places, and the behaviors that we see here by private companies were almost similar. If in the U.S. Army there isn't a ethical difference, the guys who don't understand what they're being told, who shoot too fast, this is something we see everywhere. There were a great number of abuses and great damage done by the U.S. Army as well, despite what their combat, outside of what their combat mission was. Are there other questions? I'm being asked to close the debate. Someone up there on the left.
Merci. Je voulais aussi poser la
Thank you very much. I also wanted to ask the question of the credibility of the code of conduct, especially if there are no pre-screenings of company, if all of them are able to access the code of conduct, and if, as you have said, this is also a guarantee for clients and states who look at the companies who are part of the code of conduct, who then hand them contract or give them contract, because we see that Aegis and others are part of the code of conduct. So does the code of conduct give credibility to corporations, and then what is the credibility of the code of conduct itself? Well, the credibility is that once the code is signed, the companies will have to be submitted to a certification process. We are at the very beginning. This is the only actor, the only tool in the world that allows to have a minimum of control. And of course, it's an instrument that needs to be maximized as much as possible. So of course, a company that doesn't have a policy and systems in place and who cannot be certified within the next 2 years, which is the deadline we've set for now, will have to exit the code. A corporation who hasn't repaired or taken corrective measures after a complaint or recommendation, this corporation will also be sanctioned. This is the only system that currently exists. It's starting to find form, and it's the only answer we have to this challenge for now. What means, how much staff do you have to structure this? We have a staff present in the room tonight. About 10 people are working on this issue right now. And for the process to become truly operational. But the challenge is that there are 90 companies who are now members of this organization.
Il faut qu'il y ait les moyens. Les
we need to have the means, and corporations must pay to be members. They have to pay to be certified. States will also keep financing this mechanism.
Et à un moment donné,
which could.
Sont les États qui payent ou sont les compagnies?
So it is the companies that pay, the private companies pay, but there is a diversification of sources of financing for this project.
Oui, monsieur.
Are there other questions? Yes, the gentleman on the second row. And then we'll stop. Good evening. When you speak of certification, in the case of the code of conduct, will this be done by the corporations themselves, or is it by an independent panel, or will it be yourselves who will control these companies, and with what means if you do that? Will it be done by independent companies, and isn't there a conflict of interest for the independent companies, since they're also a source of revenue for them? What interest will they have in sanctioning the companies? Well, the companies will have to present a certification done by external bodies on the basis of standards which are recognized and ratified through the Code of Conduct, and present additionally a number of information as demanded by the association and the Code of Conduct itself. They'll have to offer information on their mechanism in terms of impact on human rights, the risk in terms of human rights, and how they treat complaints. There will be a certification done by the Code of Conduct itself, but it is about defining whether the company has the system and the policies in place to respect the Code of Conduct, and then the monitoring system will take place after that. Andrew, would you like to say a few closing words?
Non, moi j'étais aussi choqué par le film, et je pense que si j'ai appris quelque chose ce soir, peut-être c'est que je pense qu'il faut être très clair, pas d'enfants anciens enfants soldats dans les compagnies privées, dans une zone de conflit, où ils doivent prendre un fusil. Il faut dire non, c'est interdit, de ne pas dire non, peut-être on peut faire un screening, peut-être dans le futur il sera moins traumatisé. Je pense qu'il faut peut-être qu'on crée un nouveau norme, pas d'anciens enfants soldats, au moins c'est clair.
Be hired. This, I feel, should be clear.
Moi, je l'ai dit au début, il y a deux
Elisabeth,
scandales
well, I felt that there are two scandals in the movie that make it the film very powerful.
J'en appelle vraiment à la
really call on the responsibility of international community, because to forbid child soldiers to become future militaries, this is about giving, I feel, a very weak response to the problematic of child soldiers and the responsibility of international community in order to prevent child soldiers from happening and to help them and to reintegrate them. And I feel this problem is not being addressed as well as it can. So it's not about forbidding them to have a job, because that's all the job they may have. It's about going much further in the opportunities offered to these children. I thank you very much. Thank you for your presence tonight. Thank you for your questions, and have a lovely evening.